Plato's Republic is the most famous work of political philosophy ever written. It has been studied, debated, and argued over for 2,400 years. It sits at the foundation of Western thought about justice, government, and how human beings should organize their lives together. Most people assume it is an argument for democracy, for the kind of society that values freedom, individual rights, and the equal voice of every citizen. Plato actually argued the opposite. He thought democracy was one of the worst possible systems of government, a system that sounds appealing, produces genuine freedom, and then almost inevitably destroys itself. His argument for why is one of the most uncomfortable things a person raised in a democratic society can read. Tonight we go inside the Republic, what Plato actually believed about justice, why he distrusted democracy so deeply, and why his critique, written when Athens was still recovering from its own democratic collapse, feels less like ancient history and more like a description of something happening right now. The Republic begins not with politics, but with a question. What is justice? Socrates is walking back from a religious festival when he is detained by a group of friends who insist he join them for dinner and conversation. The conversation that follows, running across 10 books, covering justice, the soul, education, art, mathematics, and the nature of reality, begins with that single question. Several answers are proposed and dismantled. Justice is giving people what they are owed. Justice is helping friends and harming enemies. Justice is whatever is in the interest of the stronger party. Socrates finds the problem with each one. The conversation deepens. Then Glaucon, one of the interlocutors and a historical figure who was Plato's older brother, poses the challenge that gives the whole dialogue its structure. He asks Socrates to prove that justice is good not just for its consequences, but in itself. That a person who is completely just but appears completely unjust, who has no reputation, no rewards, no social advantages from their justice, is still better off than a person who is completely unjust but appears completely just. It is a genuinely hard question, and Plato's answer to it runs for the next 9 books. Socrates proposes that they look at justice in a city first, because a city is larger than an individual, and justice might be easier to see at that scale. Then they can look back at the individual and see if the same pattern holds. A just city, in Plato's account, is one in which each part performs its proper function. The city he imagines has 3 classes: producers who create the material goods the city needs, guardians who protect it, and philosopher kings who govern it. Justice is not equality between these classes. It is each class doing what it is genuinely suited to do and not interfering with the others. The same structure applies to the individual soul. The soul has 3 parts: appetite, spirit, and reason. Justice in the individual is reason governing appetite and spirit. The person whose reason rules, who does not let their desires or their pride override their genuine understanding of what is good, is just. And Plato argues that this person is happier than the unjust person, regardless of their reputation or rewards. Because internal harmony, the soul functioning as it should, is its own reward, its own form of health. The philosopher kings, the ruling class in Plato's ideal city, are not chosen by election. They are identified through decades of education, tested by increasingly demanding intellectual and practical challenges, and eventually selected on the basis of demonstrated wisdom rather than popularity or birth. They rule not because they want to, but because they are the most genuinely qualified to understand what is good for the city as a whole. This is the part that most modern readers find immediately troubling. An unelected ruling class of philosopher kings sounds like authoritarianism, dressed in philosophical language. And the objection is not wrong. Plato's ideal city has features that are genuinely disturbing. The ruling class has no private property or family. Art is censored. The city is maintained partly through a foundational myth that citizens are told to believe. Plato knew this was troubling. He was not naive about the dangers of concentrated power. His argument was not that philosopher kings would be perfect. It was that rule by the genuinely wise, however difficult to identify and however imperfectly realized, is better than the alternatives. And the alternative he was most concerned about was the one his own city had chosen. Plato was not a detached theorist writing about democracy from the outside. He had watched Athenian democracy kill Socrates, the man he considered the wisest person in Athens, the man whose philosophical method had shaped everything Plato thought and wrote, had been tried by a jury of 500 Athenian citizens and condemned to death by a majority vote, for impiety and corrupting the youth, for asking the questions that democracy found inconvenient. That experience was formative in a way that cannot be overstated. Plato had seen the democratic system at its most characteristic, the crowd, the rhetoric, the appeal to popular feeling over careful thought, and had watched it produce what he considered a catastrophic injustice. His critique of democracy was not academic, it was personal, and it was furious. His formal argument against democracy runs through the later books of the Republic, and it is structured as a theory of political decay. Cities, he argues, degenerate through a predictable sequence. The ideal city becomes a timocracy, ruled by the honor-seeking military class. Then an oligarchy, ruled by the wealthy. Then a democracy, ruled by the many. And finally a tyranny, ruled by one. Democracy, in this sequence, is not the destination. It is the penultimate stage before the worst outcome. And the reason it tends toward tyranny is built into its defining virtue: freedom. Democratic freedom, Plato argues, is intoxicating and self-undermining. When everyone is free to do as they wish, when no authority can tell any citizen that their desires are less valid than anyone else's, the result is not harmony, but the gradual dissolution of all order. Teachers fear their students. Parents defer to their children. The old try to seem young. The boundaries that allow any complex society to function begin to dissolve under the universal pressure of individual desire. And then, in the moment of maximum freedom and maximum disorder, a protector emerges. Someone who promises to restore order, who speaks to the popular resentments that democratic excess has generated, who is given extraordinary power by the very people whose freedom created the problem, and who uses that power not to serve the people but to entrench themselves. The tyrant, in Plato's account, is democracy's child, not its opposite, its inevitable product, the figure that freedom, taken to its logical extreme without the guidance of wisdom, eventually produces. Read that sequence again and ask whether it sounds like something you have seen before, not necessarily in its completion, but in its early stages. The dissolution of shared standards, the intoxication of total freedom, the resentments that build at the edges, the figure who arrives promising order. Plato wrote this 2,400 years ago. He was describing Athens after the Peloponnesian War. The fact that it maps so cleanly onto dynamics visible in the present is either a testament to his insight or a troubling comment on how little changes. It is important to say clearly what Plato's critique of democracy does not mean. It does not mean that tyranny is better. The tyrant in Plato's account is the most miserable of all people, enslaved to their own desires, surrounded by flatterers rather than friends, unable to trust anyone, living in constant fear. The argument is not for authoritarianism, it is for wisdom as the governing principle, which is something different from concentrated power, though the distinction is difficult to maintain in practice. It also does not mean that democracy should be abolished. Plato was not writing a policy document. He was writing a philosophical investigation into what justice is and what conditions allow it to flourish. His ideal city was explicitly described as a city in speech, a thought experiment, not a blueprint, something to aim toward as a standard, knowing it would never be perfectly realized. What his critique does mean, what it has always meant for anyone willing to engage with it honestly, is a challenge to the comfortable assumption that democracy is self-evidently the best system and requires no further examination, that the will of the majority is automatically just, that popular opinion and genuine wisdom are the same thing. Plato's answer to all three assumptions is no. Majority opinion can be wrong. Popular will can be manipulated. The crowd that voted to execute Socrates was exercising democracy correctly by every procedural standard and produced a profound injustice. The system that gives everyone an equal voice does not guarantee that the voices will say anything wise. This does not make democracy worse than the alternatives. It makes it, like every human institution, something that requires constant vigilance, honest criticism, and the cultivation of genuine wisdom among its citizens. Not a given, an achievement, something that has to be actively maintained against the forces that perpetually work to degrade it. Plato did not solve the problem of justice. No one has. But he asked the right questions. What is justice actually? Not just what do people agree to call justice. What kind of person is genuinely qualified to govern, not just who can win an election? What happens to a society that mistakes freedom for wisdom and popularity for truth? Those questions haven't become easier in 2,400 years. If anything, they have become more urgent. The Republic is not a comfortable book. It was not meant to be. It was meant to make you think harder about the things you thought you already understood. About justice, about freedom, about what it actually takes to build a society worth living in. Plato thought that thinking harder about those things was the most important thing a human being could do. He spent his entire life trying to show why.